How many times have you folks done this?
Well, we tried to do it one other time and we ran into some challenges. We didn't do it. So this is our first one.
Oh,
Doing this, we've been doing it elsewhere around the country.
I figured, yeah.
Yeah, move to amend. You guys have been doing this sort of thing ever since video conferencing became possible, right?
Well, and the pandemic, yep, that's
Yeah.
about right. Beforehand, I was more doing the high touch as opposed to the high tech.
Right.
So, well, we are here, so why don't we begin?
All right.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this program this evening. It is October the 12th, and this program is getting politics to serve we the people in your part of the world, but in Iowa in general. My name is Greg Coleridge. I'm the co-director of Move to Amend, and joining me this evening during this program is Marg Dwyer, who is the vice chair of the Southeast Iowa Sierra Club, as well as Patrick Bosold, who is connected to the Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors. Appreciate people being here tonight. The agenda is just pretty simple. We're each just going to speak for about 10, 15 minutes about our work, how it relates to corporate rule and money and politics. I'm going to provide a general introduction to Move to Amend, and Marg and Patrick will talk about their respective organizations and the work that they're doing, and how it writ large does connect to issues around money and politics and corporate rule. And then we'll just open it up for some lively discussion. This is being recorded and will be shared with everyone. It will be sent out as a link to our YouTube channel as a program that can be aired anytime. So feel free, once you receive it, to share it far and wide. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully everyone can see this.
Yep.
Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to start by giving a little background for those of you who may not be familiar with Move to Amend. Just sort of, here we go. The mission of Move to Amend is we are a coalition of hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that we believe is trying to be, anyway, genuinely accountable to corporate, not to corporate interests, but to we the people. We have from day one, we've been around since 2010, the very day of the Citizens United decision. We launched, and from that point forward, we have had these principles and values. We've been committed to solidarity organizing and focused on anti-oppression work, believing that we the people have never been all the people. And if we're going to have a real democracy movement, we have to make sure that everyone is included. We focused on coalition movement building, believing that we can't do this alone. We have to forge alliances and connections and networks with organizations like those represented here at a local and state level, as well as peer organizations at the national level. But at the same time, we are committed to grassroots organizing. We have affiliate groups, individual advocates, and groups who are doing other work, but among their activities, maybe 6 or 7 activities, one of them is to promote the We the People Amendment and some of our ventures. We're dedicated to political education, believing that we have to get on the other side of the learning curve around issues of money and politics and corporate rule, because quite honestly, I don't know about you, but I never learned about any of this stuff in school, or particularly when it comes to corporate constitutional rights, even in early activism. It's something that has intentionally sort of been buried, and that we and other groups have been trying to unearth it over the past decade or more. And lastly, we're committed to political and economic independence, believing that they go together, that if you are dependent economically on a very few very well-to-do individuals, or the government, or big foundations, or corporate entities, or political parties, you are going to be influenced by the agendas and the wills and the whims of those. So these two things are inextricably connected. Our goals are to pass what we call the We the People Amendment, HR 48, which has two main principles and components: that corporate entities do not have constitutional rights, and that money is not speech. And our second goal is to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of democracy that goes beyond the We the People Amendment through a variety of other needed, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time, and maybe during the question and answer and discussion, we can talk about some of those other sorts of needs constitutionally that we feel and many other people needs to happen. To get into this whole arena of corporate constitutional rights and the like, again, many people are not aware of that corporate entities, corporations were not mentioned at all. They don't appear in the US Constitution. There is no legal legitimacy. There's no legal foundation for it. The revolution, US in part, was a revolution against not just the king or the king's army, the redcoats, but against the king's crown corporate entities. Things like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Baltimore Company, and the like. These were entities that really ruled and did governing on behalf of the king. Corporations were created or defined by we the people and public officials post-revolution via charters. Charters are like licenses. And just as a professional person, doctor, lawyer, and the like must get a license to do business, to practice in the state, so a corporate entity must get a license or a charter to practice. And those originally were done one at a time. They were granted, they were revoked in ways that affirmed the body politic and affirmed democratic control. They were a reflection of we the people being in charge. And so they were a democratic instrument. That was the intention, that was the norm, that was the default. And along the way, originally, political money had no rights. There was no free speech associated with money. So we the people in corporations, corporate constitutional rights were not, as mentioned, originally intended. It's not like gravity or the tides. It's not inevitable. It's not irreversible. They weren't created by any law or regulation passed by any elected official of any political party at any level of government or by citizen initiative. These things have only been created consciously, deliberately by corporate attorneys and activist judges. It all began with the corporate hijacking of the 14th Amendment, where the equal protection due process clauses, with a straight face, the Supreme Court said that these corporate fictions now have constitutional rights. And it is really a fraud because, I mean, we could, drill down and spend a lot of time talking about it. But basically, it wasn't even an actual decision of the entire court, but merely sort of an initial decision written unilaterally by the court reporter that was put in to the unofficial comment that the court agreed with. And that was in 1886. Yet it became precedent, and it was used sort of as a brick that was built upon to form this constitutional right, the very first of corporate entities. And others followed. Corporations won the Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. And so efforts to inspect corporate property to ensure compliance of health, safety, and welfare, these basically were defined by Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Efforts to protect private property from corporate extraction are an example of corporations winning Fifth Amendment takings rights. Efforts to limit money in elections, corporations won the First Amendment political free speech rights. That's more recent. in the 1970s, and efforts to demand food labeling or warning of potential cancer causing is an example of corporations winning the First Amendment right not to speak. So there's the right to speak, that's money in politics, but the right not to speak is also an anointment of the Supreme Court that were granted to corporate entities to prevent them from having to disclose what's in food products or potential cancer-causing chemicals in spewing out of smokestacks and the like. And finally, efforts to control corporations via charters. Corporations won rights under the Contracts Clause. Buckley versus Vallejo is one of several Supreme Court decisions, as previously mentioned, this one in the 1970s, 1976, in which for the very first time in earnest, the court determined money spent to influence elections was constitutionally protected free speech. And it applied to just corporate entities, but not just to corporate entities, but also to human beings, individuals. So that occurred in the 1970s, 1976. Many people believe all of this nefarious activity and actions and doctrines of money equaling free speech and corporate constitutional rights began with this decision, which is much more well-known, Citizens United versus FEC in January 2010. And it led and has led since then to just a worsening. Issues around the corruption of money in politics and issues around the hijacking of corporate constitutional rights occurred well before 2010, going as far back as the 1880s, as mentioned in the 14th Amendment, and the 1970s when it comes to money as free speech. But from this point forward, 2010, Citizens United, conditions got much worse when it came to money spent in elections. And there you can see the amount of money subsequently being spent in each of the presidential elections every 4 years. That arrow is just getting worse. That magnitude of money being spent, and you can see it's by both parties being raised and being spent. The 2020 election is the highest ever recorded, and that will be surely surpassed in 2024. Where we are today, it's estimated that in the midterms of 2022, $9.3 billion will be spent. That compares to $7.1 billion in 18. So just going back, you see in 2016, since that was a presidential and election, as well as a federal election for senators and representatives, $7.2 billion was spent in 2016. In the off year in 2018, 7.1 billion, so just barely less than that, despite the fact there was no presidential race. And in 2020, we're up to 10.9 billion, and we're seeing in 2022, as mentioned, it's estimated 9.3 billion. So even though there won't be a presidential election in 2022, it'll almost be as much spent this year as was spent in 2020. So we're seeing money just flooding the political process. Maybe you saw this recently, in which a secretive billionaire, well, it's been revealed, a guy an industrialist by the name of Barry Seid, has funded a new group run by the former Federalist co-chair, Leonard Leo, and has bestowed upon him and this new group $1.6 billion for a single organization that will be used for hiring and creating organizations and doing ads and doing all sorts of political things, but also a lot of advocacy, a lot of research, a lot of on-the-ground stuff. But certainly a lot of this money will penetrate into the political system. We're also seeing recently an effort by the Democratic National Committee. There was an effort within the committee to try to prevent dark money from being raised and spent in the primaries. This, many people felt, shouldn't be controversial, but unfortunately, billionaires and their super PACs must not be able to buy Democratic Party primaries, felt Bernie Sanders. However, unfortunately, the Democratic National Committee, we're not talking about the general elections, just within Democratic primaries, the DNC chose not to take a position. feeling that, this money is just flowing in. And actually, the Democrats have been raising more money in many cases around super PACs and dark money than even Republicans. That's not something they want to see cut off, unfortunately, to their peril and to our peril. And most recently, just as of September 22nd, Senate Republicans blocked what was called the Disclose Act. This would have forced the disclosure, public disclosure, not the prevention, but merely just the disclosure, the public publicity of corporate and billionaire donors of dark money sources. Unfortunately, they basically blocked it. They held it up. They refused to vote on it. And thus, we're not going to know again, in some cases, ever, who some of the donors are, whether they're from individuals or from corporate entities, where these dollars are coming from that are funneling through 501c4, what are called organizations that are like public welfare groups that don't have to disclose their charitable contributions and their money for political activism. So those 501c4 organizations, social welfare groups, that's a means, and that has become a very popular repository for those that don't want to know where their dollars, or for those who don't want to disclose where their dollars are coming from. Those are the perfect kinds of corporate entities to hide them. So I'll just simply close by saying we believe that the We the People amendment is essential for moving all of these other issues, since mega money in elections has corrupted the democratic system. Corporations have hijacked our Constitution and have been working with the judiciary to make it rule and to go against us. So everything from Medicare for all to even HR 1, which is the democracy providing, expanding democracy, having a voter, trying to prevent voter suppression, those kinds of issues under HR 1, much harder to pass since money's been rolling in through lobbyists to try to prevent that from passing. Environmental policies, consumer protection, worker protection rights, all of these things that Congress and state legislatures and even city councils try to pass have oftentimes been held up by money being spent in politics or by efforts to take those issues that may be passed at a local level and preempt them or challenge them in court by saying those are violating my corporate constitutional rights. So it's not just simply sort of a money and politics issue. This is a constitutional, we feel, democracy crisis, and not simply a money and politics crisis. Move to Amend has about 500,000 individuals who signed our petition. Our We the People amendment is up to 94. Actually, now, when you include our sponsor, Pramila Jayapal, 95 congressional co-sponsors, over 750 organizations have endorsed, and over 700 communities around the country have passed either resolutions or citizen-driven ballot initiatives. Our goals this year have been to try to get to 100 national co-sponsors. We're pretty close. More than 1,000 pledged to amend signups. These are individuals running for local office and state office to say, yes, if I'm elected, I will take this pledge and say, I will do, depending on where I am, all I can to promote the We the People amendment, to get additional resolutions, endorsements, to do more education. We organized this radical gathering back in the summer, a gathering of 29 organizations to come together to talk about our work and to promote state corporate code reforms. And what we mean by that is as stepping stones to focus on the amendment. There are things that we think individuals at the state level can do to try to change the state law or the state corporate code. That is everything from having a shareholder vote required before political donations made with corporate funds, or having like a 3-strike, you're out. That rings true in many places for individuals. If corporations are found guilty of 3 felonies, then sorry, you can't function in our state. A charter revocation, which was routine at one time in many states. Prohibit corporations from owning stock in other corporations. Prohibit corporations from being able to choose when to go out of business. This is very common for companies who are being found liable either legally or financially. They just basically, like chameleons, say, well, I'm just going to move my resource and I'm going to create another corporate entity. And I'm going to move all my employees, my assets over to that, and make shareholders or make stockholders liable for corporations' debts. These are all kinds of reforms that could be enacted simply by passing a law at the state level that we're going to be getting into more this year and next year as sort of a stepping stone. So I just end by saying, no, nature never gives up, neither should we. All right, so that's my dog and pony show. We can get into questions, answers, cussing, and discussing any or all of this after Marg and Patrick go. So Marg or Margaret, go ahead.
Yep, sure. Well, as Greg said, I'm the co-chair of the local Southeast Iowa Sierra Club, and our mission is to engage our community in better understanding and appreciating and protecting nature. That sounds, sounds nice and all, but when you dig into it, it kind of connects to everything. And so our goals under that mission are to mitigate climate change, because if we don't do that, there isn't going to be any nature to appreciate. To transition to 100% clean renewable energy sources, to restore vitality to our wildlands, our wild waters, and our wild forests, and to transition to zero waste through thoughtful consumption, waste reduction, and redirection. And in chasing after those goals, it's become increasingly clear to me that there are a lot of barriers and that we're thwarted in many, many directions. A fundamental question that comes up is, what's the purpose of government? Is it to preserve the good of the common, or is it to promote commerce? And while it seems in general that Republicans come down on the side of promoting commerce and Democrats come down on the side of preserving the common, I think it's a false dichotomy. First of all, I think the answer is both and, not either or. And what it seems to me, though, is that, as Greg explained, our state and federal government is totally unbalanced because it's overly influenced by PACs. And both parties seem to be more interested in staying in power than they are in preserving the common or promoting commerce. And then that whole attitude has trickled down to the local level. It used to be that your school board elections and your city council and your, those are not political. They were apolitical, and now they've become political. And even school boards, which is painful to me. I was on school board for 10 years, and to see how much it's become politicized is just really painful. But what's trickling down to the local level is party loyalty. You have to vote with the party. You have to stand with the party. You have to walk the talk, and not necessarily talk about what's best for your community or your school or whatever. And I've become disillusioned because I used to think, the Democrats are good guys and the Republicans are bad guys. And I don't feel that way at all anymore. I feel like the whole party system is challenged and maybe broken. I think both parties are keen to keep their own power. And an example, a few years ago, I think it was 10 or 12 years ago now, in Iowa, the Democrats had the trifecta. They controlled the state house, they controlled the Senate, and they had the governorship with Chet Culver. And many of those people who got elected had campaigned on an issue of campaign finance reform. But when they got in power, all of a sudden that conversation stopped and nothing got done, nothing at all. And they could have done it. They had the trifecta, but it didn't happen. And that didn't happen because campaign finance reform reduces the power and the reach of both parties. And so neither party is really for it, I don't think. So Greg asked us to talk about what's the impact of corporate overreach on our work and on our future plans. So in the Southeast Iowa Sierra Club, I can tell you that it's reared its ugly head in a number of ways. And here are some examples just in our efforts, impacting our efforts towards zero waste. For one thing, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Iowans think the bottle bill was a great thing and wanted to strengthen it and continue it, oddly enough, it's continually being attacked and gutted by corporate interests. So why is that? Another reason, another factor is our legislature in Iowa passed a preemptive bill forbidding any municipality to ban single-use plastic bags. Now, who asked for that? There are many problems in our state, but that wasn't one of the big ones that I think we needed our legislature to spend time on. And it's pretty infuriating to see that that's the kind of stuff that's getting done when the big stuff isn't being touched. The 700 or more impaired waterways aren't being discussed, and there are many other things that aren't being discussed. A third factor is the right to repair. I don't know if you've heard anything about the right to repair, but it's a kind of an up and coming topic. You can't open your cell phone to fix it. You can't open your computer to fix it, or you nullify the warranty. And it's starting to creep in. It applies to lots of different appliances. You have to buy a special screwdriver that costs $135 to get into the bottom of the appliance and fix something small. And recently it started to apply to farm machinery. Well, farmers did not like this. The farmers did not like the idea that their John Deere tractor, when it wasn't working, they had to wait for somebody to come out from Des Moines or from someplace else to fix it when they had a 2-hour window to finish the harvest or whatever it was. And so here's an area where the Farm Bureau and Sierra Club are on the same side. Right to repair is something that has to be embedded in our manufacturing economy if we're going to get to a circular economy, which I personally believe we have to get to a circular economy if we're going to have abundance in the future. I will say, however, corporations aren't really keen for a circular economy because it means there's going to be big changes in manufacturing, big changes in production, big changes in what their profit, how they derive their profits. And that's not something they want. They consider that to be disruptive and chaotic, and it's a problem. And I submit that if we do not do that, if we do not move to a corporate, a circular economy, things are going to be much more disruptive, much more chaotic, and much more problematic down in the future. A fourth area in terms of our work towards zero waste, planned obsolescence. That's a pillar of the consumer economy and the infinite growth mentality, and it's got to go. That's a non-starter, of course, for a circular economy. And then the final one that I'll mention for zero waste is the recycling myth. This is really a myth that was perpetrated by corporations, that the trash and waste problems that we are experiencing are our fault, are their consumers' fault. And they don't ever talk at all about how that has, what connection there might be with wanton, thoughtless production. And that, to me, is another example of corporate overreach that's impacted our work a lot. As for our goal of mitigating climate change, increasing resilience and restoring vitality to our wildlands, here are a couple of thoughts. One, the carbon capture pipelines, and Patrick may be speaking about these as well. The carbon capture pipelines and the funding and the schemes around them are disastrous for climate change, in my opinion. They siphon money and attention and action away from steps that could actually make a difference in the climate change battle. And these projects provide no public benefit at a huge public cost. And, you know, there's a lot of money in the IRA Act to subsidize carbon capture. And I think it's unfortunate because that money could be much better spent in many other ways that would have a much stronger impact on mitigating climate change. Another area, there are very lax confined animal feed operation regulations. And my own opinion is that the meat packing industry has been very much overprotected, and it's making the future of environmentalism look kind of bleak in Iowa. Our legislature has made it harder for anyone in Iowa to sue for any kind of a nuisance that might flow from a CAFO. My opinion is that OSHA and pandemic regulations and existing laws were very poorly enforced in this sector, in the animal and meat packing sector. And right now, the DNR, Iowa DNR, is doing a 5-year review of the regulations around Chapter 65 of the Iowa Code, which governs animal feeding operations. And so if you have some thoughts, I urge you to contact them and let them know what you think. I think it's good that they're doing this review. I think they're going to hear a lot of things, a lot of suggestions for improvement. I hope they'll take them. I have my doubts, but I hope they will. And then finally, our legislature has consistently resisted funding the 3/8 sales tax for water quality and natural resources that the voters approved in a referendum over 12 years ago. And so those are some of the ways that corporate overreach has interfered with the work of the Sierra Club. And then in my final area of renewable energy goals, investor-owned utilities such as Alliant seem to have strong legislative support to continue to resist the development of microgrids. Personally, I think microgrids are essential for a climate resilient energy grid and for sustainable communities. And I offer you the example of the Babcock Ranch community in Florida, which was built about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was built specifically to withstand hurricanes. And so it was built with a lot of attention to native plants. It was built 25 feet higher than the surrounding area. It had specific building codes about window thickness and durability against high winds. It was built with a solar and water off-grid systems. And it was right next to Fort Myers, which was completely decimated by Hurricane Ian last week. Babcock Ranch never lost power. They never lost water. They never lost Wi-Fi. They lost a couple of solar panels from the roof. That's it. And the people of Babcock Ranch, Florida, are helping to run shelters for all the other people whose houses and workplaces were ruined. And so, you know, with proper building codes and proper attention and proper insurance demands, we can upgrade things and be more climate resilient. But so far, I've seen mostly just resistance to that. And I have some ideas about effective ways we can promote democracy and better ways to approach some of these things. I'll save them though for after Patrick's spoken, and then we'll go to that topic. Okay?
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Took a lot of notes. Great. And we can get into it. All right, Patrick.
I took some notes too. Marg, excellent presentation on a range of topics. I'm going to piggyback, if you will, onto the topic specifically of animal feeding operations, confined animal feeding operations in Iowa. Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors was formed in Fairfield, Iowa, which is the county seat of Jefferson County. Oh, I think around 2003, 2004. This was after a couple of years right at the turn of the millennium, when a handful of us in the Sierra Club at the time started looking around at what was happening in surrounding counties 5-6 years after the state passed a law prohibiting counties from doing any regulations of agriculturally zoned land. That history is worth noting because in 1995, House File 519 passed the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate, was signed into law by then Governor Terry Branstad. And you'd want to ask yourself, well, so what? So what if the state reserves the right to regulate any activities in agriculturally zoned land? Well, there were some people in the legislature who knew what the industry was up to. And this was a straight up pork industry, confined animal feeding operation play, and they got away with it. And since then, Iowa has now risen to year over year, increasingly record numbers of impaired waters, surface waters especially. This is primarily largely a result of over-application of raw, unprocessed, untreated waste from hog confinements, almost entirely. You got to ask yourself, go back to 1995, how did they get away with this? How did a law like that get through the Iowa legislature? If you look at the answer, what you will see is the influence of money on our legislative process. It's a textbook example. The Farm Bureau and the agribusiness industry in Iowa have long since had a lock on the legislature because of this. As a side note, I had a friend who was a supervisor in Johnson County, Iowa, who consistently and strongly opposed any expansion of hog confinements in Johnson County. The Farm Bureau was upset enough about this that they ponied up the money and made arrangements for several thousand Republican voters to change registration and take this guy out in the Democratic Party primary. If we had intelligent laws on the books prohibiting that kind of political spending, you wouldn't be seeing things like this. What we see instead is that kind of behavior that was particularly egregious. But my point when it comes to what JFAN does, and JFAN does two things. It was founded to oppose the onslaught of confined animal feeding operations in Jefferson County, Iowa. Thank heavens they showed up, because if you look at the statistics since they became active and how they have gone about opposing more new hog confinements in Jefferson County, they have not stopped it, but they've slowed it way down. It's the rare shining exception, bright light, if you will, for folks like us in the state of Iowa. We are surrounded in Jefferson County by counties that have just been completely overwhelmed by this. And again, since the time that law went into effect, there have been year after year after year attempts to put in stronger regulations, strengthen the master matrix requirements, which is a test that any confinement over 1,250 head of hogs or livestock, animal units, must pass. And just not getting anywhere with any of it. And if you ask yourself, why is that? For the last 5 years, JFAN has been part of a larger group called the Iowa Alliance for Responsible Agriculture that has just said, look, we need a moratorium on these things. No more new livestock confinements, no expansions of existing livestock confinements. That expansion syndrome is the way a lot of operators have gotten around what regulations there are to prevent continuing growth of that phenomenon in the industry. And where we've wound up is nowhere. That bill for a moratorium on any new CAFOs never even got out of a subcommittee in any year that the legislature was in session. This past summer, the interested parties and a couple of legislators who tried to get something done with this held a people's forum in Ames, Iowa, because that's the only place you could even hold a hearing on this topic. You couldn't do it in Des Moines. You couldn't do it in the legislature. That from start to finish is big money talking. And that is when you talk about, I mean, Greg, thank you for bringing up the numbers at the national level for what midterm election spending is going to look like by the time we get to November the 9th. It's going to be over $9.3 billion. And it's appalling, but it isn't just, it isn't just there. This percolates down, as you said earlier, to every level of government. I had a Jefferson County supervisor admit to me years ago, he said, yeah, you know, money actually does even influence supposedly nonpartisan City of Fairfield and Jefferson County supervisor races. It just does. And you don't know where the money's coming from, and they don't have to disclose it. And it makes a mockery of democracy is what it does. So very specifically for the work that Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors does, and the other thing the organization advocates for very actively and in a very well-informed way is trying to get farming into a space where soil is being conserved and built. Agriculture becomes regenerative rather than extractive. Animals are put out on pasture and they live a life that is according to their nature, what they like to do, which is graze and root, this kind of thing. You can farm and you can raise livestock profitably under those circumstances. No question about it. It's been proven over 30 years by an organization called Practical Farmers of Iowa, here in Iowa. And the reason that you don't see much more state government support for this sort of thing is, again, big money speaking at state level politics. And Marg made an excellent point. The Democrats held power in all three branches of government in the early and mid and later aughts. I personally asked the Speaker of the House on at least 2 occasions, why are you not bringing campaign finance reform to a vote in the Iowa House? And he hemmed and hawed a bit. The last thing he ever said to me about it was, if the Democrats do that, they will be out of power for a generation. In the next election that followed that conversation, he was out of power and out of office. So were the Democrats, and they have not been back. So politics and party politics can call it what they will. They've fallen in love with the cash flow, and it's been detrimental to all of us, including everything that Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors wants to do for the benefit of just about everybody. So those are my comments for now in terms of what the impacts of money in politics and corporate personhood have been for JFAN. So Greg, I'm going to send it back to you. And then of course, let's open this up for questions and comments from anybody who's with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Patrick, both to you and to Mark. And on cue, let us open it up. Holly, and I'm sorry, your name again? Who's
Mark.
listed as owner Mark?
Mark Carita. Yep.
Mark, great. So comments, questions, concerns, consternations, queries.
This is Holly Hart. I'll go just, I'm actually in Iowa City, and you've been here at least once before and presented some really excellent presentations back when people were able to go to places live. And our local chapter, our group got our county supervisors, and I think it was one of the first or maybe only county supervisors to sign on to that statement, the calling or the statement calling for a constitutional amendment. And then after that, things kind of just, interest went to from something else. But it sounds like there's been a lot of, I just happened to get on tonight because I was on a listserv that Patrick Bosold is on and saw it. And it looks like there's a lot of, there's been some updates and developments and new information, as time has gone on for the last few years. And so it might be interested if you're continuing to do these, to do another presentation, maybe for some of our groups here. That would be very nice. So thank you. I have to go soon too, but I really wanted to get on and just check it out, and glad that this is still going forward.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for being on however long you can, and appreciate you taking the time and making the priority. And yeah, we'd be happy to, do something similar to this. And you're in the Iowa City area, if I recall.
Yeah, she's in
Yes,
Iowa
yes.
City. And Mark, you
Yeah.
probably have plenty of connections there, but Holly, if Greg would like, could I share your email address with Greg for an additional
Sure,
contact there?
absolutely. Yeah.
That would be okay. Good. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually I do have your.
You may, because we had an official group, and our former chair,
Right.
I don't know what is going on with her. She's not in town, but we had, a number of people that were still interested. Sorry, the light there. But yeah, no, I think it would be interesting. And especially now, again, just to kind of resurface this, as I think people were kind of, so yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
sadly, these issues are not going away anytime soon.
No,
And
they're not.
there is, obviously attention for right purposes and legitimate reasons to some extent. Quite a bit of concern and attention given to the midterms coming up. So I get it. Mark, do you have any
Yeah,
comments?
Yeah, I do have a couple of comments in terms of effective ways to promote real democracy. First of all, personally, I think the We the People Amendment is brilliant. And I have great admiration for the work that your organization is doing and plugging away at it, for 10, 12 years now. Because the problems aren't going away by themselves, and I'm glad that you're persisting. I'm very interested in bipartisanship or non-polarization, if you want to call it that. I'm very interested in initiatives like Braver Angels, if you've heard of Braver Angels. I can explain if that's not clear.
Yep.
There's an organization called Environmental Voters Project, which also seems really smart, really intelligent, good way to move towards helping us build democracy. And then the Citizens Climate Lobby. And in many years, I have put out political yard signs. Lately, I feel like I don't want to do that because not that I don't support candidates, I certainly strongly support candidates, but I feel like I don't want to put out a dog whistle in my neighborhood for people who have opposite perspectives. You know, I'd rather have a conversation with my neighbor who may be voting in the other direction. And if I put up my yard signs, we aren't going to have a conversation, probably. So the other thing I think would be really helpful is ranked choice voting. And I'm for that because I think that it empowers voters and it disempowers the parties. And I have to say I'm leaning towards disempowering the parties as time goes on. And I think the only thing that's going to bring about changes like the We the People amendment are what you talked about, grassroots organizing. It's just going to have to be a groundswell of push from every direction that makes it impossible to ignore. So that's my 2 cents.
Very good ideas, very good suggestions and the like. And I can respond to a couple of those later, but I'm interested, Mark, any comments, questions?
Well, I'm just listening and I'm just wondering, there is something I read in the New York Times today. It's about the Nobel Prize winners of last week. You know, there were 3 given out, and one was a organization in Russia called Memorial, and then there was one in Ukraine. And what one of the representatives of one of the organizations was quoted as saying today was that she was surprised at how much things can change with, you know, everyday people just putting their shoulder to the wheel, you know, and trying to just push that rock a little bit. Ralph Nader has said this a lot. He talked about he talked about the amendment that allowed 18-year-olds the right to vote. And that amendment to the Constitution, it was done practically overnight. If you compare it to, you know, what's going on, how the glacial pace that things are happening in Congress. I mean, it happened in literally just a number of months. And he's been saying over and over and over again that it takes, I can't remember the percent. He's got it down to the actual percent. He said, but when this percent of people in a given area or state, what have you, start moving on something, things change. And it's a very small percent, very small. So I'm just wondering what I can do to help what you folks are doing there in the Midwest. I live in the western part of New York State, but I've known Patrick for a long time, and I would love to, you know, get involved and help in any way I can.
Where do you live in New York?
I live in the western half of New York, southwest of Buffalo, a place called Salamanca. It's just a little town like Fairfield, but it's in the western part of New York State.
I was born and raised in upstate New York, Mark. I'm from Syracuse originally.
Okay.
Also have lived in Albany and Utica, and I have family up in Lake Placid.
Oh,
And friends in Rochester, and spent some time in Chautauqua and
okay.
Ithaca.
Oh, well, have you ever heard of Salamanca?
I haven't, but I assume it's sort of to the left of the Finger Lakes.
It is, yeah, it's to the
Yeah.
southwest of the Finger Lakes. Yeah.
Okay.
Salamanca. How do you spell it?
It's Spanish words, Salamanca.
Okay, I had Ka.
See it.
Huh. Yeah,
See,
Yeah.
right. Interesting. Great. Well, appreciate you joining and inquiring about what can be done. Just a couple of responses to things that were mentioned. These ideas, Marg, that you mentioned of promoting democracy, movement is always felt. We don't talk about being bipartisan, but transpartisan.
there you go.
Because we think that this
Better.
transcends any political party, all political parties.
Yep.
It's an idea,
better
as you know,
term.
Victor Hugo said, Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And certainly this idea of that our country isn't broken, but rather it's fixed, it's rigged. People get it, people understand it in their gut that something just doesn't add up. And when, the whole system, really political system, is ultimately foundationally built on one thing, really, when you come right down to it, trust. If we don't trust one another, you're going to be afraid to walk out your front door for all kind of reasons. And if you're afraid to walk out your front door, then you can't come together and do things collectively. And we as human beings are in many cases certainly individual, but in many cases we're also collective and social, and we need one another to do things, to survive and to thrive. And if we don't trust one another and we don't trust the institutions that we create, then we are in really deep fundamental trouble. And money in politics and the whole sort of capturing by special interests, be they individual or institutional, is really diminishing trust. So Holly, bit adieu to her. I will follow up with her and try to get something going in Iowa City. And so, doing something that transcends political parties is very important. And if I understand it, Braver Angels is the effort to get people together, right? Left and right?
It's left and right to talk to each other
Right.
with some guidelines.
Right.
To be cautious about rhetoric, to use terms, to stick with facts, not opinions, and to be mutually respectful in talking about topics. And it's pretty amazing when you follow good communication rules and those guidelines that you can have an intelligent conversation. You can learn something, you can share something, you can come away not necessarily changing each other's mind, but having new respect for each other. And that seems to be something that's missing also. We don't have trust and we don't have a lot of respect. And we need more of both.
Yeah, and we're not really authentically conversing.
No, we're not talking at all.
And so having those opportunities of forums. Now we put together something, and I could share it. I'll make a note of it to share it, a document that tries to say how this issue of getting money out of politics and corporate constitutional rights is a quote unquote conservative issue. So it's a talking, we put together these talking points to try to frame the conversation and making the points using language. People on the quote unquote left use issues like democracy and self-determination, and people on the political quote unquote right use terms like sovereignty and the like. So, it kind of sort of means the same thing, having the fundamental right to decide on issues that affect our lives and our communities, but sometimes different words are used, and those need to be, I think, understood, recognized, and the like.
Right.
So we have that document out there. These organizations you mentioned, Environmental Voters Project, Citizens Climate Lobby, there are a number of other groups like that that are doing terrific work at trying to bring pressure to bear on public officials in a highly respectful way. I used to work for a Quaker organization, the American Friends Service Committee, that was more grassroots oriented, but we had a lobby sort of sister or brother organization called FCNL, Friends Committee on National Legislation, that is very similar to like Citizens Climate Lobby. They know how to communicate, how to approach public officials in a very respectful way that gives people the benefit of the doubt, looks at people and treats them with dignity and respect, but when needed can be very firm. And what we like to say is, we try to help people see the light, but when they can't, then they need to feel the heat. And that comes from organizing and from having grassroots efforts that really does bring pressure to bear on people and to make them uncomfortable at taking positions that are hurting people and harming the community, if not the natural world. So we have to make sure that we sort of understand and proceed in initially giving people the benefit of the doubt and always treating people with dignity and respect. But at the same time, Move to Amend is dedicated, and we're going to be in 2020 23 much more focused on what we're calling escalation tactics. And in 2024, so individuals who, for whatever reason, they're not responding, their constituents feel like they should be responding, we need to put more pressure. And some of that pressure comes from efforts that I think Mark mentioned in quoting Ralph Nader and in talking about the small percentage of people. There is a political scientist and historian named Erica Chenoweth, who has, along with others, looked at the history of social movements and the history of how you even get rid of, authoritarian, violent dictators. And what she and her colleagues have found is that you really need two things to happen. One, you need to have, a majority of people behind you who support what you're doing. But secondly, all you need, and this is sort of the magic number, 3.5%. 3.5% of the population who are really, going to the turf, who are spending time, significant time, doing lobbying, doing education, doing civil resistance, whether that's nonviolent, well, it's always nonviolent, but protesting, lobbying, vigiling, but also risking arrest, as our brothers and sisters in the past have done in many social movements, whether it was women driving themselves into the Constitution where they should have been to win the 19th Amendment, the civil rights movement, the gay movement around the 70s and effort, the transgender movement now, the effort to get 18-year-olds to vote. That took, like, as Ralph Nader said, something like 21 months, maybe less than that, for that to happen. I mean, there are social movements galore now, and the environmental movement, at least nationally, is sort of ratcheting up, where people are organizing in ways that are just unbelievably, I think, wide and deep. And so that kind of effort, where, yeah, you need to convince 50% of the population to whatever it is, but you also need to be able to recruit just that small number of real solid core people who are willing to do things. So I would, Chenoweth is the last name, Chenoweth, Erica. Look her up. She's done work sort of in the spirit of a guy named Gene Sharp, who looked at the history of nonviolent social movements going back to the Greek and Romans up to the relatively recent time. He passed away, I don't know, 5 or 6, maybe it's been more than that. Maybe it's almost been a decade ago, maybe not that long ago. But she is sort of carrying the torch, as well as others. The Engler brothers, who have written a terrific book called, I'll find it, This is an Uprising, that looks at the history of social movements sort of in recent times and how that has happened. And it's just a terrific example of bringing people together from the grassroots up and forming alliances and forming really movements that we need to do. The only other thing I'll mention is, Mark, you're in Western New York. Don't know if you have many friends or you have many contacts in, your part or in the areas nearby, whether it's in Ithaca or those areas, but would love to do something like this in your part of the world, if that would be of interest. So,
yeah, yes, and I'm also thinking about moving back to Washington, D.C. I lived there for most of my entire professional life, I should say, I suppose, from 90 till just recently. But I am thinking about moving back there, and if I move back there, I definitely want to be a citizen activist.
yeah, terrific. And ranked choice voting, that is picking up. As some of you may know, there in the most recent elections at the local level and at the congressional level, there have been
What kind of voting did you say?
Ranked choice
ranked
voting.
choice voting.
Oh, ranked choice, yeah.
Yeah,
The high
State of-
profile example was
Alaska,
Sarah
right?
Palin, Alaska's, the first ever Native Alaskan to take a federal office, nudged out Sarah Palin, who was, of course, considered a lock for the thing. But ranked choice voting and the way it worked it took out a lot of the it took out winner take all politics.
Yeah.
And it's a real worthwhile reform as at least as a stepping stone, because if you do that enough, we will start to get people who will pay attention to the need for a We the People amendment.
Right. For the two of you in Iowa, a couple of things that, could be done to help sort of move things along and to sort of potentially work together. I'll just name four things. One is to whoever your federal representative is post-election, to approach him or her to see if he or she or they may be interested in co-sponsoring HJR 48. Your next local elections, again, we have this Pledge to Amend campaign where we try to get local public officials, county public officials, state reps, state senators, because the truth of the matter is your federal representatives of today were your state senators and state representatives metaphorically yesterday, and the day before that, they were your city council people and mayors. And they're a lot more accessible, aren't they, at a local level than they are trying to reach your congressperson or your senator. So trying to develop those relationships and get them on the other side of this learning curve is an opportunity to help them, understand how corporate rule and money and politics connect to the issues that you're working on. So that could be something you could do. Third, if your respective organizations have not endorsed this effort and the We the People Amendment, please consider doing so. A number of environmental groups and local community organizations, labor and citizen action and faith organizations and law firms across the country. Again, I mentioned my remarks, something like more than 750. And lastly, we have something that we call on our website, something called corporate rule stories, where people sort of give first-person accounts in writing how their work is connected, how it is impinged or inhibited by money in politics or corporate constitutional rights, sort of telling their story. And so we are, expanding that beginning at the end of this year and next year in audiovisual forms, to where we'll do sort of interviews. So, I mean, both of you kind of told your respective stories, but they were part of this. I mean, I'd love to, if either or both of you were interested, to either invite you to write something up, or we could do just sort of a one-on-one that you could do something similar to this. And then we put it on the website. We make it available to you for you to put it on your website to show the connections and to show the interrelationship that we really do, quite frankly, need one another. We need people working from the bottom up, because quite honestly, the issues that people work on at the local level are putting a human face or an animal face, in the case of CAFOs, on these problems, because, issues of money and politics and corporate constitutional rights, those are hard to sort of make people understand at a gut level or at a level that hits you between your eyes. So being able to focus in this integrative way is a way to help, I think, and how we're trying to present it in a mutually beneficial way.
Good.
I was just thinking about Occupy Wall Street, and I was part of that in Washington, D.C. And kind of the rap on it was, and on us was kind of like, well, you guys are here and, this has been going on for a while. We had a permit by the Park Service to occupy certain places that people lived at in tents and so forth in Washington and D.C. But people lived there and occupied those spaces long past the permit date or the due date, you might say. What I'm trying to say is that, the question was asked, well, what good has this done? And my response is, well, it really gave rise to, I think it really gave rise to or helped solidify the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, and probably the Liz Warren campaign. The progressive left in Congress was, it accompanied people like AOC into office on Capitol Hill where now there's this group of five, I think they call themselves up there. But I mean, I think it was the precursor, that has established progressivism on Capitol Hill and is really strong. I mean, there's people like Ro Khanna, for example, talking about not selling the Saudis any more parts for their fighter jets, as a result of them trying to screw us with, a reduction in oil production. I mean, it's gotten traction. I mean, we've gotten our stuff on. And I think it's here to stay. We just have to keep pushing. And I hope that I can do something from this part of the world to help you folks in what you're doing. Because I don't know anybody else doing what you're doing out here, for example.
Well, we have a couple of Congress people in New York who have co-sponsored, but we had a couple of people in Buffalo at one time working on this. It's just something on Occupy. Occupy gets a bad rap in a sense of, and some of it is deserving. But I think they were, part of it was inherently not going to be as successful because you had these two different groupings. You had these people coming together with two different goals that tried to coexist. One was, we're trying to create an alternative culture. We're trying to create a new way of existing and decision-making that's horizontal and all equal and the like. And others said, we want to create sort of programs. We want to do stuff. We want to be advocates. We want to get out there and organize, to protect people from losing their homes and a variety of other things, going after the bank. Remember, Occupy came about at the same time as the Tea Party. And the Tea Party, before both were co-opted, okay?
Tea Party was before Occupy, really.
Yeah, a little bit. But I mean, both shared sort of the analysis of going after the big banks.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah, which was kind of interesting.
Yes.
But the thing of Occupy that I thought was very successful in changing the culture, one was, to sort of focus more on horizontal leadership and decision making. But the other was, it created in the whole society the whole thing of the 99% versus the 1%. I mean, we weren't nearly as sort of cognizant of it as we are now, thanks to Occupy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So terrific.
Actually, I don't want to really mention his name, but I'll say that there's a former president of the United States. When he ran for the presidency, he actually talked about breaking up the big banks. Nobody remembers that about him now, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, he did. That's for darn sure.
Yeah.
Well, anything else people want to share?
Are you folks connected with a national organization? I mean, isn't this part of a larger umbrella organization called, Move to Amend?
Yeah, Move to Amend is a national organization. I'm in Ohio, and I'm one of the co-directors, and so we have 50-some affiliates around the country and a number of advocates, individual advocates, who are sort of the Johnny and Jane Appleseeds of what they're doing and in spreading the word in their respective communities.
I was going to say there's a radio host. He's on CNN on Saturday mornings. His name is Mike Smirkanish. And then there's a great former C-SPAN journalist named Steve Scully. And the two of them this last weekend had something called the Unconvention. It was called the Unconvention 2022 in Philadelphia. And it was an alternative, type of meeting with like-minded people trying to, like I think we are, trying to bridge the gap and talk to the other side, and it encouraged people from all sides to attend this convention, or this unconvention as they called it. But I think there's a lot of these organizations, disparate organizations, that I think if we just linked up together, we could create something like a bona fide movement, and to get this stuff on that would have, like as you presented at the beginning of this meeting, a number of things that we want to do besides take money out of politics, and amend the Constitution.
Well, the last thing I'll say is on that point, the two goals I mentioned of Move to Amend. One is to try to pass this We the People amendment, but second is understanding that by itself doesn't go far enough. And so toward that end, we have created sort of a project it's called Toward a People's Constitution. And we had an initial gathering in December on Human Rights Day, December 10th, 2020, and are continuing that effort where we are going to be bringing people together who feel that we need to look at broadly and deeply the very document that we call our defining document. That, what is a constitution, but just something that tries to codify our aspirations and inspirations and lay down the basic principles of our country that, there's a few things about that they got right initially and a whole lot that they didn't get so right, that needs to be thought about, rethought, amended, if not suspended, and replaced with some things that really are much more protective of people, places, and the planet, that people 200 and some years ago had no conception of, and in some cases completely intentionally ignored, meaning basically people of color, women, indentured servants, native people that were 3/5 of a person, if any percentage of a person to begin with. So we do need some serious updating of that. And so there are people coming together. Our friends on the other side are certainly thinking in those terms and talking now about even a constitutional convention. They're 5 states away from calling for that some of the items on their agenda are not very pretty from our standpoint that they're talking about. So we need to pay some attention to what is going on and do some of our own organizing. So with that, you'll be hearing more of that as well, coming from Move to Amend and from sort of another group that we're working very closely with called Democracy Unlimited. They'll be talking about this Toward a People's Constitution. So,
Greg, one thing I wanted to say about Move to Amend that I really appreciate. A lot of political action organizations are based in around Washington, D.C. Move to Amend is based in Sacramento, California. They're outside the Beltway. And I really think from time to time that makes a difference. I mean, it's not just the different geographic location, but efforts like Move to Amend show up in DC every once in a while, but the language is just not quite right. And that's where I think, Move to Amend shows a particular type of strength and clarity that I really appreciate. So I want to continue to be aligned with the organization, pay attention to what you guys are doing, and of course, try to make any headway we can here in our community with more support for it. It's an outstanding effort, and both of the things that you've touched on tonight, the 2 prime objectives now of the organization, are just, it's mission critical.
Well, thanks for that. We have been quite intentional in saying that it's important not to be headquartered inside the Beltway because it's too easy to get sucked into it, quite honestly. It's way too easy. And the other thing I'll say is, thanks for the kudos about what we're doing, but we need people, particularly in sort of rural areas, who are working on issues that we need to be able to communicate with people in other places like where you are around the country. And so what are the issues? And particularly farm issues and agriculture issues and issues around sustainability and sustainable land and zero waste and the things that Marg mentioned, incredibly important. I mean, to be able to work with the Farm Bureau, that's pretty remarkable. And so the right to repair, good example of a way to sort of work like that. So, I would be very open to try to, get your ear on finding how to shape and frame some of the issues that you're working on in ways that connect with corporate rule that then we can share with others in other rural areas around the country. Because it's extremely important. It's not just the urban or suburban or exurban. I mean, those are okay. Those are important places and important constituencies. But so are rural areas in which there's a lot of low-income people, a lot of poor people, a lot of people that are being, hit square between the eyes and in the gut, and whose land and homes and livelihood are being catastrophically impacted. So we have to pay attention to that and communicate that and find some solidarity.
Definitely.
I agree with all the things that Patrick said, and maybe we can put something together locally, Patrick, with Greg's help.
Let's give it some thought, see
Yeah.
where we think there might be opportunities for headway.
Yeah, I'll give it some thought as well, and we can communicate that way. So I'll be in
Okay.
touch with all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Sorry for taking so much time. It's probably dark there now, but anyway,
It's all right.
have a good rest of the evening and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Greg, thanks. Mark, thanks for
Solidarity.
joining us.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you all.
inviting me.
Patrick,
Bye now.
Greg,
Marg, you
bye-bye.
too. Thank you.